This is lecture 125B, The Battle for Moscow. And this is the set of lectures accompanying forthcoming Volume 7, which will be published in a couple of weeks. And our subject this morning is the Battle for Moscow. Just a preliminary comment that's not in the text here is what we're going to do is take a look at the Battle for Moscow, the Battle for Stalingrad, the Battle for Kursk, the Battle for Eastern Europe, and finally the Battle for Berlin. And at that point I'm going to conclude Volume 7 for this year, and we will have covered the major turning points. So this is the first one, the Battle for Moscow. Now, by the end of the summer of 1941, 1 million Kraut soldiers were dead. Nevertheless, Hitler assigned Army Group Center to take Moscow in what he called Operation Typhoon. Now, Typhoon included 4 infantry armies, the 2nd, 4th, 9th, and 6th, supported by 3 panzer groups, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and Luftflotte II, that is the 2nd Air Army, which had already lost 1,603 aircraft, destroyed 1,028 damaged, and had only, at that moment, 549 serviceable aircraft. Now, these included 158 medium and dive bombers and 172 fighters. Panzer armor included 2,470 tanks and mobile guns, and German artillery featured 14,000 heavy guns. Altogether, 2 million German troops were committed to the operation. Now, attack tactics featured panzer groups penetrating behind Red Army fronts and then executing double pincer movements to pocket Red Army divisions and destroy them piecemeal. They had originally learned this deep battle from the Russians after the Rapallo Treaty brought Kraut officers and men to the USSR for secret training. Now facing the Nazis were 3 Soviet fronts. They formed a defensive deployment between the cities of Vyazma and Bryansk, barring the way to Moscow. By this time, these Red Armies had gained considerable experience in heavy fighting. They were also a formidable concentration of 1,250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 7,600 guns. The Soviet Air Force had lost over 10,000 aircraft. However, much to the Kraut High Command's amazement, Red industry had replaced these. So the Red Air Force mustered at that moment to 936 aircraft, 570 of which were bombers, and many more were secretly on their way from Siberia, accompanying an additional 400,000 men. Okay, at the beginning of October 1941, German forces pressed east to encircle Moscow, aiming to flank the city from the north and the south. Continuous fighting had reduced their effectiveness, and logistical difficulties became far more acute. Now, the German attack witnessed the 3rd Panzer Army pushing through the middle of the Vyazma-Bryansk line. Then it split its mobile forces north to complete the encirclement of Vyazma. The 4th Reinforced Panzer Army closed the ring around Bryansk in conjunction with the 2nd Panzer Army. Now, the spearheads of the 2nd and 3rd Panzer groups met at Vyazma on Friday, 10 October 1941. 4 Soviet armies, the 19th, 20th, 24th, and 32nd, were encircled in a large pocket just west of the city. Now, the encircled Soviet forces continued to fight. The Krauts had to employ 28 divisions against them. These troops should have been on the offensive to Moscow. Now, the Soviet Western and Reserve fronts performed a retrograde movement and formed a new defensive line around Mozhaysk. Now, some of the encircled units broke out. They ranged in size from platoons to full rifle divisions. Red resistance at Vyazma gave the Soviet High Command the time it needed to reinforce the 5th, 16th, 43rd, and 49th Armies defending Moscow. Turning the tide. Then 3 rifle and 2 tank divisions secretly arrived from East Siberia. A huge force followed these from Siberia, and together they took up position in front of the Ural Mountains just behind Moscow. Now, Stalin had ordered this deployment to supplement the neo-Napoleonic battle plan after Richard Sorge gave him the good news, namely that the Japanese Imperial High Command had definitely decided against invading the Soviet Far East, and the certainty of another massive ass-whipping. Meanwhile, Krauts behaved as if they had only to face what their original combat intelligence had told them. Their 2nd Panzer Group executed an enveloping movement around Bryansk. It linked with their advancing 2nd Army and captured Orel by Friday, the 3rd of October, and Bryansk by Monday, the 6th of October. Now, on Tuesday, the 7th of October, 1941, the first snow fell and quickly melted, turning roads and open areas into muddy quagmires. The German armor bogged down. Soviet forces fell back, regrouped, and counterattacked. The 4th Panzer Division fell into an ambush set by Dmitry Lelushenko's 1st Guards Special Rifle Corps, including Michael Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade, near the city of Emsensk. Now, secretly built T-34 tanks were concealed in the woods, and German armor rolled past them. A skirmishing team of Soviet infantry contained that advance. Then Red Army T-34 tanks attacked on both flanks and annihilated the entire German Panzer IV tanks, all of them. For the Kraut High Command, the shock of this defeat was so great that a special investigation was ordered. Guderian and his troops discovered to their dismay that the Soviet T-34s were almost impervious to German tank guns. He wrote, quote, "Our Panzer IV tanks, with their short 75mm guns, could only explode a T-34 by hitting the engine from behind." Guderian also noted in his memoirs that the Russians already learned a few things. Red Army resistance had slowed the Kraut offensive. So then, on the 10th of October, 1941, a Friday, they arrived, the Germans did, within sight of the Mozhaysk line west of Moscow and encountered another powerful defense line manned by new Soviet forces. That same day, George Zhukov took charge of Moscow's defense and the combined Western and Reserve fronts. Colonel General Ivan Konev was his deputy. On the 15th of October, 1941, Stalin ordered the evacuation of the Communist Party, the General Staff, and various civil government offices from Moscow to Kubyshev. That's Samara. It was Samara before it was Kubyshev, and it is again. Now, Stalin remained in the Soviet capital, calming the public. Now, the Mosaic defense line from Monday the 13th of October to Thursday the 30th of October is something we need to take a close look at. By the 13th of October 1941, the Wehrmacht, that's the German army, had reached Mosaic's defense set of 4 lines of fortifications protecting Moscow's western approaches, extending from Kalinin towards Volokolomsk and Kaluga. Now, 90,000 Soviet soldiers manned this line, too few to stem the German advance. But given the limited resources available, Zhukov concentrated his forces at 4 critical points. The entire Soviet Western Front was recreated. First, the 16th Army under Lieutenant General Rokossovsky guarded Volokolomsk. Secondly, Mozhaysk was defended by the 5th Army under Major General Govorov. The 3rd and the 43rd Army of Major General Golubev defended Maloyaroslavets, and 4th, the 49th Army under Lieutenant General Zakharin protected Kaluga. Moscow itself was fortified. 250,000 women and teenagers worked building trenches and anti-tank moats around Moscow. Zhukov reported that they moved 3 million cubic meters of earth with no mechanical help. Moscow's factories had been converted to military tasks according to the long ago prepared plan, which we have reviewed in previous books and lectures. Now, one automobile factory was turned into a submachine gun armory. A clock factory manufactured mine detonators. The chocolate factory shifted to food production for the front. Automobile repair stations worked to fix damaged tanks and military vehicles. All of this according to the plan. Now, nevertheless, the capital was within striking distance of Kraut armor. Now, the Luftwaffe mounted large-scale air raids on the city that caused little damage because of the anti-aircraft defense and effective fire brigades, but made a lot of noise. On Wednesday, the 15th of October, the Wehrmacht resumed its offensive. Now, at first, the Krauts tried to bypass Soviet defenses, pushing northeast toward Kalinin and south towards Kaluga and Tula. Now these they captured except for Tula by the 16th of October. Then they launched a frontal assault against the fortified line, taking Mosaics and Maloyaroslavets on the 18th of October, Nero-Fominsk on the 21st of October. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Army, advancing on Tula, was slowed by bad weather, lack of fuel, and damaged roads and bridges. Now, Guderian did not reach the outskirts of Tula until 26 October. The Krauts took Volokolomunsk on 27 October. After intense fighting, Zhukov fell back, withdrawing his forces east of the Nera River. The German bypass plan depended on a fast capture of Tula. Then Guderian planned a pincer move around Moscow, but that was repelled by the 50th Red Army, reinforced by civilians, on the 29th of October. On the 31st of October 1941, the Kraut High Command halted offensive operations. Logistical failure in the winter maximum and massive losses were the cause. Nazi forces were worn out, with only a third of their motor vehicles still functioning. Infantry divisions were down to a third or half strength. The Krauts had no warm clothing or winter equipment. Hitler seemed to surrender to the idea of a long struggle. Meanwhile, on October 16, 1941, Stalin had decided to evacuate the government to Kubyshev, formerly Samara, where critical Civil War battles were fought in 1918, and that was done, while the highest party leaders would stay in Moscow and run the war. On October 28, 1941, the Nazi bombing of Moscow drove Stalin and the others underground to the metro. There they had an emergency bunker headquarters, and they were listening to the boss explain the strategy. On the 7th of November 1941, they had the Revolution Day parade. Stalin ordered that the traditional military parade on 7 November, that is Revolutionary Day, in Red Square, would go ahead as planned. Soviet troops paraded past the Kremlin, marching directly to the front. The parade carried a great symbolic significance by demonstrating the continued Soviet resolve, and was frequently invoked as such in the years to come. By this time, 100,000 additional Soviet soldiers had reinforced Klin and Tula to fight the Krauts in counteroffensives against Nazi lines. West of Moscow, near Alexino, Red Army tanks inflicted heavy losses on the Kraut Fourth Army when the Nazis were struck by the new T-34s. All this time, the massive counterstroke of reserve elite troops and Siberian Army troops was being prepared out of reach of Kraut air reconnaissance. Now, the symbolism of the boss and the Comintern's number one, George Dimitrov, standing side by side atop the Lenin Mausoleum, was of inestimable value as the climactic battle between capitalism and socialism approached. Tanks, artillery, airplanes, and soldiers paraded through Red Square and then went straight to the front, now only a few miles from Moscow. Stalin spoke to them from atop Lenin's mausoleum for 30 minutes. Quote, "Brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, citizens, and comrades, I speak to you today as we prepare to meet the fascist menace now so near to our dear working-class revolutionary capital. I want to assure you that the mighty Red Army is fully deployed to deal with the threat. Furthermore, I want you to realize when this battle is concluded, the Nazi spearhead against our country and our just cause will have been liquidated. Despite the propaganda of the Nazi worldwide capitalist press conspiracy against us, the fact is the Germans have suffered grievous losses. We know they have suffered over 1 million dead soldiers since their June invasion. Their military machine is grinding to a halt thanks to the heroic resistance of our great Red Army and the sudden appearance of our best ally, Old Man Winter. Now, Hitler must have been rather ill-educated to forget what happened to Napoleon in the winter. We have a new and powerful ally in the form of the United States of America, and I have already agreed with its president to conduct a common war against Hitlerism and the Mussolini gang. Now, let each and every one of us march from here to the front. Again, as at Kronstadt, let it be so again, everything for the front." By the 15th of November 1941, the Wehrmacht High Command had been forced to forget about a rapid seizure of Moscow. Army Group Center was exhausted and unable to move. Its fighting capabilities had been reduced to those of a starving horde. Simultaneously, the fascists were becoming aware of the appearance of Red reinforcements from the east. Now this terrified their field commanders. It had suddenly dawned on the Kraut High Command that Stalin might have accumulated large reserves. What had appeared to be imminent victory could suddenly become a disastrous defeat. Stark terror soon made ship run down the legs of Hitler's generals. The Soviet rifle divisions occupied a much stronger defensive strategic deployment. There was a triple defensive ring surrounding Moscow and an effective mosaic line near Klin. The Soviet field armies now had a multi-layered defense, each with at least 2 rifle divisions in reserve positions. Artillery support and sapper teams were concentrated along the roads the Krauts had expected to use in their attacks. Now there were many Soviet troops in reserve armies behind the front. These Red Army officers and men were blooded and prepared for any Kraut offensive. Into this prepared defense walked Kraut infantry, dizzy from combat and cold, a mere remnant of Army Group Center. The armored Wehrmacht spearhead, consisting of 51 divisions, advanced over frozen mud. This time their goal was to encircle Moscow and link up near the city of Noginsk, east of the capital. One wing of the pincer was the German 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups, concentrated between the Volga Reservoir and Mozaisk, then proceeded past the Soviet 30th Army to Klin and Solnechgorsk, encircling the capital from the north. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Group, intending to bypass Tula, still held by the Red Army, and advanced to Kashira and Kolomna, linking up with the northern pincer at Noginsk. The Kraut 4th Field Army was to pin down the center of the Western Front. On 15 November 1941, they began their offensive toward Klin. The Nazi attack split the front in 2, separating the 16th Army from the 30th. Several days of intense combat followed. Zhukov says, quote, "The enemy, ignoring the casualties, was making frontal assaults, willing to get to Moscow by any means necessary," unquote. Despite the Wehrmacht's efforts, the multi-layered defense reduced Soviet casualties as the Soviet 16th Army slowly retreated and constantly harassed the German divisions which were trying to make their way through the fortifications. The 3rd Panzer Army captured Klin after heavy fighting on Saturday, 23 November, and by Sunday, 24 November, Solnechgorsk as well. Soviet resistance was still strong, and the outcome of the battle was by no means certain. Stalin asked Zhukov whether Moscow could be successfully defended and ordered him to speak honestly like a communist. Zhukov replied yes by springing the Siberian trap. And now we come to the grinding of sausage. By the 27th of November, the German 7th Panzer Division had seized a bridgehead across the Moscow-Volga Canal. This was the last major obstacle before Moscow, now less than 22 miles from the Kremlin. Then Zhukov ordered a powerful counterattack by the 1st Shock Army that drove the Krauts back. Northwest of Moscow, the Nazis reached Krasnaya Polyana, 18 miles from the Kremlin. Altogether, German forces were severely depleted. Many regiments had only 1 company left. On the 18th of November 1941, in the south, near Tula, combat resumed, with the 2nd Panzer Army trying to encircle the city. However, it was so torn up from previous fighting and soldiers with no winter clothing as to be barely recognizable. Consequently, initial German progress was only 3 to 6 miles per day. The German tank armies were subjected to constant flanking attacks from the Tula-based and refitted Soviet 49th and 50th Armies. Guderian took Stalinogorsk on 22 November 1941. On 24 November, artificial floods began with the blowing up of the Istra Waterworks Reservoir Dam. On the 28th of November 1941, the water was drained into the Yakroma and Sestra rivers from 6 reservoirs, as well as from Ivankovo Reservoir using dams near Dubna. This caused some 30 to 40 villages to become partially submerged, but it certainly flooded out the Krauts. On the 26th of November, German tanks approached Kashira that controlled a major highway to Moscow. A Soviet counterattack stopped them cold the following day. The Krauts were thrown back from Kashira in early December. Tula always held, protected by fortifications and determined defenders, both soldiers and workers. In the south, the Wehrmacht never got close to the capital. On the 30th of November 1941, von Bock reported to Berlin that the temperature was 49 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero. General Erhard Rauss, commander of the 6th Panzer Division, kept track of the daily mean temperature in his war diary. It shows a suddenly much colder period during the 4th to the 7th of December, from 37 to 38 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The European winter of 1941-42 was the coldest of the 20th century. German troops were freezing with no winter clothing, using equipment that was not designed for such low temperatures. More than 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported among German soldiers. Frozen grease had to be removed from every loaded shell, and vehicles had to be heated for hours before they could be used. On the 1st of December 1941, Hitler and Guderian persisted, attempting a direct offensive from the west along the Minsk-Moscow highway near the city of Narofo-Minsk. This offensive had limited tank support and faced strong Soviet defenses. After meeting determined resistance from the Soviet First Guards, Motorized Rifle Division, and flank counterattacks staged by the 33rd Army, the German offensive stalled. Then it was driven back 4 days later in the ensuing Soviet counteroffensive. On the same day, the French manned 638th Infantry Regiment, the only foreign formation of the Wehrmacht that took part in the advance on Moscow, went into action near the village of Dyutkovo. On the 2nd of December 1941, a recon battalion came to the town of Khimki, 19 miles from the Kremlin, and reaching its bridge over the Moscow-Volga Canal. This was the closest Kraut approach to Moscow. Smashing the Nazis at Moscow. The Japanese capitalists resisted the strong pressure from Berlin to enter the war. Although they had just discovered Stalin spy Richard Sorge operating from inside the Nazi embassy in Tokyo, it was too late to undo the work he had done for the Soviets. The Japanese had been burned so badly at Kalk and Gold 2 years earlier, thanks to Sorge's intelligence and Stalin's sending of Zhukov's superforce to Mongolia, that they opted not to get involved. Stalin had his confidence in Sorge reinforced. Sorge had correctly predicted the Nazi attack down to the day. Accordingly, the boss was able to transfer crack Red Army divisions from the eastern frontier to his western one, right in front of the Urals, ready to pounce on the Krauts approaching Moscow. On the 5th of December 1941, the Nazi offensive ground to a halt. And on that day, the Soviet winter counteroffensive began, and that was the beginning of the payback. The counteroffensive for removing the immediate threat to Moscow started on the Kalinin front on the 5th of December 41. The Southwestern Front and Western Front began their offensive the next day. On the 6th of December 1941, one day before the USA came into the war because of the 7th of December attack on Pearl Harbor, Stalin launched the counterattack that almost ended the war in Europe. That Japanese attack on the USA could just as easily have been a Japanese strike against the USSR. It would have been had Stalin not launched the counterattack against the Japs along the Kalkin-Gol River in Mongolia 2.5 years earlier. Now Stalin, knowing that the Japanese were not going to enter the war on Germany's behalf, was able to send a seemingly limitless number of fresh Siberian troops from the east. Assembled behind Moscow in front of the Urals mountains, they hit the Nazis like a tornado in a cornfield. The invaders knew only death and destruction in front of Moscow. Stalin had placed his Siberian warrior chieftain, General George Zhukov, in charge of the Red counterattack at Moscow. And here he did, on a much larger scale to the Germans, what he had done to the Japanese a little over 2 years earlier. At battle's end, the Red Army had smashed the German Army Group Center and thrown them back 150 miles. Although the Nazi Army Group Center offensive had been stopped, German intelligence estimated that Soviet forces had no more reserves left, and thus would be unable to stage a counteroffensive. In reality, Stalin had transferred over 18 divisions, 1,700 tanks, and over 1,500 aircraft from Siberia and the Far East. The Red Army had accumulated a 58 division reserve by early December. Then Red Army forces numbered 1,100,000 men, with additional troop deployment. A ratio of 2 to 1 of Russians to Krauts was achieved. Now, this trap is sprung. On 7 December 1941, the Soviet offensive continued in the north, liberating Kalinin and Klin, overrunning the headquarters of the 16th Panzer Corps outside the city. As the Kalinin front drove west, a bulge developed around Klin. The Soviet front commander, General Ivan Konev, attempted to envelop any German forces remaining. Zhukov diverted more forces to the southern end of the bulge to help Konev trap the 3rd Panzer Army. The Krauts barely escaped as the encirclement unhinged the Nazi defense. A second attempt was made against the 2nd Panzer Army near Tula, but it also met with strong opposition near Arzev and was forced to halt, forming a salient that would last until March of 43. In the south, the offensive went equally well, with southwestern front forces relieving Tula. On the 8th of December 41, Hitler had ordered the Wehrmacht to form a defensive line along the whole front, but the Kraut troops could not do it. On the 12th of December 41, Soviet armies retook Solnich-Ogorsk and liberated Klin on 15 December. Guderian's army panicked in retreat towards Venev and then Sukhanichi. The threat overhanging Tula was completely removed, and on the 14th of December 41, Franz Halder and Gunther von Kluge finally gave permission for a limited withdrawal to the west of the Oka River without Hitler's approval. The Luftwaffe was paralyzed in the second half of December. The weather recorded a minus 42 degrees centigrade or minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was a meteorological record. Logistical difficulties and freezing temperatures froze what boaters the Germans still had, and in the meantime the Luftwaffe had virtually vanished from the skies over Moscow, while the Red Air Force grew stronger. On the 16th of December 41, the Red Army encircled and destroyed the German 39th Corps, protecting Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army's southern flank. On 19 December 41, General Walter von Brauchitsch was fired. On 20th of December 41, Hitler canceled the withdrawal and ordered his soldiers to defend every patch of ground, digging trenches with howitzer shells if needed. Between the 17th and 22 December of 41, the Luftwaffe destroyed 299 motor vehicles and 23 tanks around Tula, hampering the Red Army's pursuit of the German army. On 25 December 41, Guderian was dismissed, along with Generals Hoppner and Strauss, commanders of the 4th Panzer and 9th Army, respectively. Fedor von Bock was dismissed for medical reasons, having suffered a nervous breakdown. On the 26th of December 41, the Red Army liberated Narofominsk, and on the 28th of December 41, the Red Army liberated Kaluga. The Kraut Dunkirk. On the 2nd January 1942, the Red Army liberated Malo-Yaroslavets. On the 4th of January 41, the skies cleared. Hitler tried his own Dunkirk desperate move to save the situation. The Kraut bombers groups 2 KG-4 and 2 KG-30 arrived from Germany. 4 Kraut transport groups with the strength of 102 Junkers, Ju-52 transports, were deployed from Air Fleet 4 to evacuate the surrounded Nazi army units. It was a last-minute Dunkirk-type effort. The German air arm prevented a total collapse of the Kraut Army Group Center, as Churchill's sea lift had saved the British Army. On the 7th of January 42, the Red Army counteroffensive halted, after having pushed the Nazi armies back as much as 155 miles from Moscow. Stalin and Zhukov cleaned up on the miserable Krauts. The Red Army's winter counteroffensive had forced the Wehrmacht from Moscow, and for the first time since June 1941, Soviet forces had stopped the Germans and driven them back. A documentary film, quote, called Rout of the German Troops Near Moscow, was made during the battle and rapidly released in the Soviet Union. It was taken to the USA and shown in the Globe Theater in New York in August 1942, where the New York Times reviewer commented that the savagery of that retreat is a spectacle to stun the mind, As well as the Moscow parade and battle scenes, the film included images of German atrocities committed during the occupation, the naked and slaughtered children stretching out in ghastly rows, the youths dangling limply in the cold from gallows that were rickety but strong enough." Unquote. The defense of Moscow became a symbol of Soviet resistance against the invading Axis forces. To commemorate the battle, Moscow was awarded the title of Hero City in 1965 on the 20th anniversary of Victory Day. A museum of the defense of Moscow was created in 1995. And I'm going to conclude here with an inside snapshot of Stalin and Zhukov together on the 1st of January 1942. And Zhukov says, "I'm sorry, Comrade Stalin, they ran beyond our reach, and we won't be able to complete the development." And Stalin replied, "You've done magnificently, George, you and the entire Stavka. The Moscow front is 200 kilometers further west, and the capital is permanently secure. You're getting 2 more stars for this, and here they are. You see, our intelligence system is working as well, if not better, than ever. Half of those cocksuckers that came at us in Moscow are dead. You killed at least 350,000 of them. They do not have the strength in men to come at us again on their Army Group Center front, and most of their materiel is useless because of lack of maintenance and weathering and wear and tear. They will not be able to move against us here. And now I want you to go to Leningrad and take charge of the defense there. Zhdanov is our party boss for Leningrad. He's been in charge there for 7 years now, ever since the assassination of Kirov. He's one of our top 4 secretaries, one of our best historians and Marxist theoreticians, and he has a solid grip on every aspect of life there. Consequently, he has the civil situation in hand. But he needs you to build a permanent military bulwark against Army Group North. Therefore, their only remaining offensive possibility will be with their Army Group South. So while you are stabilizing our Leningrad front, in the meantime, we will see how Hitler will move in the spring. Our foreign intelligence networks indicate he is raising 500,000 more men, some 50 divisions from satellite countries, to fill out the losses in Army Group South. Now, I presume they will head for the oil at Baku and Batum. This is not good for us. What I mean is, we won't be able to get an ambush situation like Moscow again unless he turns his spearhead against some city to the east of the current front in the south. For us, the spring and summer campaigns will have to be ones of stall and retreat, attrition, and behind-the-lines sabotage. Now, however, I want you to know, and whomever you need to tell at Stavka, that by October 1st this year of 1942, we will be back to pre-war production rates in all key military industries, from coal to steel and machine tools for heavy industry, and the heavy industrial and tank and aviation factories behind the Urals. Now, we may have to burn the oil fields in Baku and Batum, but we have plenty of oil in storage in Siberia, and as much more as we need by train from Vladivostok, thanks to our American friends. Our weapons stockpiles are being rebuilt as we speak, and we will have 10,000 T-34 tanks by November and 5,000 Sturmovix. That's our ground attack aircraft, called air tanks or tank busters. So we have to wait anyway while you stabilize the northern front. Now, perhaps we can launch some spoiling offensives soon, but only those strong enough to indicate that these are the best we can do. But get Leningrad secure first, and then we'll see what we can see. Immediately thereafter, Zhukov left for Leningrad, where he and the party boss for Leningrad, Andrei Zhdanov, restored order and established a permanent defense for Leningrad against Army Group North. After 7 months of war, 1.5 million German and satellite soldiers lay dead. With a little more expertise and experience in dealing with such large military forces, the Red Army would have been in Berlin in May of 42 instead of May of 45. In Satan's hell, Hitler was not learning the lessons of the war. He had a preconception of the war's outcome from which he would not deviate. At the center of his obsession was the idea that the Soviet capital was of secondary import as a war aim. To bring the Soviet Union to its knees, Hitler thought it meant its economic destruction. This he could accomplish by seizing the Ukraine east of Kiev. Hitler decided to surround the Soviet forces at Kiev and then seize the Donbass. At first, and on the surface, his strategy seemed correct, because the Red Army lost nearly 1 million men killed, captured, or wounded by 26 December of 42. But then Hitler decided to target Stalingrad, concluding his strategy in victory. What are you planning? You don't think they'd be dumb enough to walk into it again, do you? Zhukov asked the boss. George, I didn't think Hitler would be stupid enough to attack us to begin with. Therefore, I do not want to make a decision based on what the intelligent thing to do would be. Logic says go for the oil, and he has little choice. Their industrial machine has only weeks to go before it grinds to a halt for lack of oil. Yet, they don't need 2 million men to go for rural Caucasus. I think Hitler wants a major worldwide known communist city. What better city than the one named after me, which is, after all, one of our show cities. George, I've instructed both the Chika and G2 to keep the idea of an easy success in Stalingrad, and what a great victory for Nazism it would be in front of Hitler and his general staff, and especially in the fanatical elements of the Nazi Party. George, if you can come up with some way to indicate to the German codebreakers that 1, we have no strategic reserves left, and 2, we have no tactical strength in the south to defend the Volga at all, and 3, what an easy and highly valuable target and acquisition Stalingrad would be, and 4, everything else our agents are doing, then George, perhaps we can entice the little corporal into an ambush one more time. And Zhukov replied, I'll get right on it. I know we can plant all of that shit through our combat intelligence feed to Wehrmacht wireless spies, now that we have Enigma, thanks to Philby. That's a stroke of genius, Cole. I don't know why I didn't think of that. So I'll talk to you on the telephone as soon as you get to Leningrad. I need to know today what the situation looks like. And at that point, Zhukov left and Stalin went back to his desk. And that concludes for us this lecture on the battle for Berlin. And it's important to recognize this as the first step in the destruction of the Nazi war machine. The second step is coming up, and that will be at Stalingrad.